I am 33 years old, a senior construction supervisor in Boise, Idaho, and 2 years ago I bought a 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb of Meridian Heights that I was absurdly proud of because I had worked brutal hours for almost a decade to afford it, taking extra shifts, managing crews in freezing rain and blazing heat, and saving every bonus check instead of spending it on vacations or new trucks like some of the guys I work with. When I signed those closing papers, I remember sitting alone in the empty living room on the hardwood floor, looking at the bare walls and thinking that for the first time in my life something truly belonged to me. It was not flashy, but it was solid, practical, and spacious, with a finished basement, a wide backyard, and enough bedrooms that I told myself I could host family comfortably when they visited. 14 months ago, my parents and my younger brother Kyle moved in temporarily. That was the word they used over and over again, temporarily, as if saying it often enough would prevent it from stretching into more than a year. Their lease had ended. Kyle had changed jobs again, and they framed it as a short transition while they figured things out. I agreed, because that is what I have always done. I have always been the stable one, the responsible one, the one with the steady paycheck and the mortgage and the predictable routine. I told myself it would be a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, and I had the space, so why not? Those weeks turned into 14 months of higher utility bills, a fridge that was never stocked the way I left it, muddy boots by the door that were not mine, and constant background noise in a house that used to be quiet. I paid the mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance, the internet, and most of the groceries without making an issue out of it, because every time I considered bringing it up, my mother Diane would sigh dramatically about how hard things had been for them lately, and my father Harold would remind me that family helps family. Kyle, who is 29, drifted from job to job, making jokes about how I was corporate now, because I supervised crews instead of swinging a hammer full-time. Last Sunday, I hosted dinner like I always do. I grilled steaks in the backyard while my mother made a salad, and my father poured himself a beer from the fridge I paid for. The house smelled like charcoal and garlic butter, and for a few hours it felt almost normal, like we were just a family enjoying a meal. We ate at the long oak table, I bought specifically, because I imagined future holidays around it. Conversation bounced from local news to construction projects in town to Kyle complaining about his boss. I mostly listened, nodding, trying to ignore the low-simmer resentment that had been building in me for months. Dessert was my mother's idea, a store-bought cheesecake that she set down in the center of the table with a flourish, as if she had baked it from scratch. We were halfway through our slices when Kyle leaned back in his chair, grinning in that lazy, provocative way he has when he thinks he is being funny. He said casually that we should eliminate the useless people in this family, and that Nate will be first because he is only good for his paycheck. He said like it was a clever punchline, like we were all supposed to laugh at how absurd it was. My mother did laugh. It was not nervous or restrained. It was a full, genuine laugh, the kind she uses when she finds something genuinely amusing. My father smirked and added that I do make decent money, as if that was a defining trait of my entire existence. In that moment, something in me went completely still. I felt the fork in my hand grow heavy. 14 months of quiet irritation crystallized into something sharp and clear. I looked around the dining room, at the light fixture I installed myself, at the walls I had painted, at the floor I had refinished, and I realized that the people sitting at my table saw me as nothing more than a walking income source. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my hand on the table. I set my fork down carefully and looked directly at Kyle first, then at my parents. I told them that if I am only good for my paycheck, then they should pack their bags because this house is not the family's house. It is mine. The words came out calm and even, which somehow made them land harder. The room went silent in a way that felt physical, like the air had been sucked out. Kyle's grin disappeared immediately, replaced by a stunned expression as if he could not believe I had taken his joke seriously. My mother's face tightened, and my father straightened in his chair, the beer bottle frozen halfway to his mouth. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like a full minute of everyone recalculating their positions. Then the accusation started. My mother said I was being dramatic and selfish, that we are family and family does not throw each other out over a joke. My father said I should be grateful that I even have family to share my home with. That money changes people, and maybe it had changed me. Kyle muttered that he was kidding, and that I needed to learn how to take a joke. The tone shifted so quickly from light banter to open hostility that it felt like watching a storm roll in across a flat field, sudden and unstoppable. I stayed seated. I told him I had not brought this up before, but I had been covering almost every expense for over a year. I told them that I never agreed to be reduced to a paycheck with a pulse. My voice was steady. But inside, I was shaking with a mix of anger and disappointment that I had been swallowing for months. What hurt the most was not the joke itself, but the laughter that followed. The easy agreement that my value could be summed up in a salary number. The dinner ended not with plates being cleared and coffee poured, but with raised voices echoing through the dining room I once felt proud of. Kyle pushed his chair back hard enough that it scraped across the hardwood. My mother stood up abruptly, saying she could not believe I would humiliate them in my own home. My father said we would talk about this when everyone had calmed down, but there was no calm left in the room. As I stood there in the aftermath, cheesecake half eaten on the table, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. For 14 months, I had let the word temporary stretch beyond reason, because I did not want conflict. In a single sentence, I had drawn a line I should have drawn long ago. The house felt different that night, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the argument. And I knew that whether they admitted it or not, none of us would ever sit at that table the same way again. I worked 65-hour weeks on average, sometimes more when a project is behind schedule or a subcontractor drops the ball, and I earn about $9,200 a month before taxes, which sounds like a lot until you factor in the mortgage, the insurance, the fuel for my truck, and the basic reality that nothing in Idaho is as cheap as it used to be. I bought this house entirely on my own, signed every document without a co-signer, and committed to a $2,100 monthly mortgage because I calculated everything carefully and made sure I could handle it comfortably on my income. Back when I lived alone, my finances were predictable and controlled. My electricity bill hovered around $160. My groceries averaged about $450 a month because I meal prepped and ate simply, and I rarely had surprises beyond routine maintenance. When my parents told me that rising rent had forced them out of their apartment, they presented it as a sudden and unfair blow. They said the landlord had raised the rent again, that they could not justify paying that much for a place that did not even have a yard, and that they just needed 4 months to regroup and find something more affordable. For months sounded manageable. 4 months felt like a defined sacrifice, a temporary inconvenience in exchange for being a supportive son. I told them they could use the 2 guest rooms upstairs in the basement if they needed space, and I made it clear to myself that this was not permanent. I even marked a rough date in my head when the 4 months would be up, as if the situation had a built-in expiration. The shift started gradually, almost invisibly. The first electricity bill after they moved in jumped higher than expected, which made sense at first because there were more lights on, more showers, more laundry cycles. Then it climbed again and again until it was sitting at $390 a month. I remember staring at the online statement, refreshing the page as if it might change. The house was not any bigger than before, but it felt like it was constantly humming with usage, televisions on in different rooms, fans running, the thermostat adjusted without anyone asking me. My groceries spending more than doubled, climbing from around $450 to nearly $1,200 monthly because the fridge was no longer filled with simple ingredients for one disciplined person, but with snacks, sodas, prepackaged meals, and whatever my mother and Kyle felt like adding to the cart. I never formally asked them to pay rent at first because I told myself they were my parents and this was temporary. I covered utilities, groceries, internet, and even the streaming subscriptions Kyle insisted he needed to unwind after work. Even though he rarely held a job longer than 5 months, he would get hired somewhere, talk about how this one was different, how he finally saw a path forward, and then within a few months he would be back home during the day, claiming the manager was incompetent or the schedule was unfair. The pattern repeated so often that it stopped surprising me. The first time I tried to bring up contributing financially, I approached it carefully. I chose a calm evening after dinner, when everyone seemed relaxed. I explained that the bills had increased significantly, and that even a few $100s a month from each of them would help balance things out. My mother did not even let me finish before she leaned back in her chair and said that they raised me for 18 years, that they paid for my food and clothes and school supplies without sending me invoices, and that I should not nickel and dime my own family. The phrase stuck with me because it reframed my request for basic fairness as greed. My father nodded in agreement, saying that family does not operate like a landlord and tenants. Kyle avoided eye contact and scrolled through his phone. After that conversation, every attempt I made to revisit the topic was met with some variation of the same argument. They reminded me of childhood expenses, as if my existence had been a debt I now owe with interest. They implied that because I earned more, I should naturally carry more. The underlying message was clear. My income was communal, but the house was not truly mine in practice. I started to notice small changes in the way they behaved in the space. My mother rearranged furniture without asking. Kyle invited friends over while I was at work. My father used a garage as if it were his workshop, leaving tools and scrap within piles that I had to navigate around. Coming home after a 65-hour week used to feel like stepping into a controlled environment where I could decompress. Now it felt like walking into a building that happened to have my name on the deed, but did not function according to my rules. The kitchen counters were cluttered with dishes that were not mine. The trash filled faster than I could take it out. The thermostat was rarely set where I left it. Even the silence was gone, replaced by background television noise or arguments drifting from upstairs. Financially, I could still manage the expenses, but the principle of it weighed on me more than the numbers themselves. Watching my electricity bill jump from $160 to $390 was not just about the extra $230. It was about what it represented. A doubling of consumption without a doubling of responsibility. Seeing grocery totals approach $1,200 each month felt less like generosity and more like being taken for granted. Every swipe of my card at the store felt heavier. The house that once felt like a milestone began to feel occupied rather than shared. I would sit in the living room at night, exhausted, and instead of pride, I felt tension in my shoulders. I started parking in the driveway instead of the garage because Kyle had filled it with his projects. I kept important documents locked in my bedroom because I no longer felt comfortable leaving them in the office downstairs. It was subtle but constant, a sense that I was hosting an extended stay I had not fully consented to. What unsettled me most was how normalized it became for them. My paycheck deposited twice a month like clockwork, and expenses were simply absorbed into that rhythm. There was no acknowledgement, no gratitude, just an expectation that this was how it should be. Over time, I realized I had drifted from being a son, helping his parents for 4 months, into being their primary financial support system indefinitely. I had not signed up to be anyone's personal ATM. Yet that is exactly what I had become, and the house that once symbolized independence now felt like a place where my independence was quietly eroding. Last week I worked just over 70 hours because one of our major sites was behind schedule, and I stayed late every night coordinating crews, reviewing safety reports, and dealing with suppliers who kept pushing back delivery dates. And by the time Friday evening came around, I felt like my brain had been sanded down to nothing but raw nerves. All I wanted was a shower in my own bathroom, 5 minutes of silence in my own bedroom, and maybe a full night of sleep without anyone knocking on my door to ask where I keep the extra batteries or whether I have seen Kyle's charger. I pulled into the driveway after dark, shoulders aching, hands stiff from gripping a steering wheel and a clipboard all week, and even before I walked inside, I told myself to just get through the night without conflict. The first thing I noticed when I walked into the house was that something felt off upstairs. The hallway light was on, and I could hear my parents' television playing from the direction of the master bedroom, which made no sense because that room was mine and had always been mine since the day I moved in. I climbed the stairs slowly, exhaustion turning into a dull sense of unease. And when I pushed open the door to what was supposed to be my bedroom, I stopped dead in the doorway. The room was no longer arranged the way I had left it that morning. My bed was still there, but my clothes were gone from the dresser, my nightstand had been moved, and my personal items had disappeared from the bathroom counter. In their place were my mother's cosmetics neatly lined up, my father's shaving kit by the sink, and their suitcases half unpacked in the corner. The closet doors were open, and my shirts and jackets were missing. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if I had walked into the wrong room, but a view from the window confirmed it was mine, the backyard fence and the same tree line I had looked at every morning for 2 years. I found my belongings shoved into the smaller guest room at the end of the hall, folded carelessly into drawers that barely closed and stacked in uneven piles on the bed. My shoes were crammed into the corner, and my work boots were sitting on top of a box of winter clothes. It looked less like a relocation and more like an eviction carried out in my absence. I stood there staring at the cramped space that had once been reserved for visitors and felt something inside me go cold. When I went back to the master bedroom, my parents were sitting on what used to be my bed watching television, as if nothing was unusual. My mother muted the volume and said that they had decided it made more sense for a married couple to have the larger room with the attached bathroom, and that I was only one person, so I did not need all that space. My father nodded and added that it was more practical this way. They said it like they had rearranged furniture in a shared apartment rather than taken over the primary bedroom in a house I own. I told them that they had no right to move my things without asking me. My voice sounded distant even to myself, like I was observing the situation from outside my body. My mother sighed as if I was being unreasonable and said they assumed I would understand because family shares. I did not argue further in that moment because I was too exhausted and too stunned to form a coherent response. I walked downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, and tried to steady my breathing. Later that night, still unable to sleep in the cramped guest bed, I opened my banking app out of habit. I had been saving aggressively for the past year and a half with the goal of purchasing a rental property, and I had accumulated $52,600 in a separate savings account that I never touched. It represented discipline, long weekends spent working overtime, and every small sacrifice I had made while others spent freely. When the account loaded, I blinked because the number on the screen did not make sense. The balance showed $41.17. At first, I thought it was a glitch. I refreshed the app, logged out, logged back in, and the number remained the same. My transaction history showed a transfer 3 days earlier for $38,900 to an account number I did not recognize. The description was vague, no familiar name attached, just a string of digits. My hand started shaking so badly that I had to set my phone down on the table. 3 days earlier, I had been on site before sunrise and had not checked my savings account because I never needed to. I trusted that what I earned and set aside would remain there until I decided otherwise. I walked upstairs immediately and asked my parents and Kyle to come downstairs. My voice was steady but tight, like a wire pulled too far. I told them that nearly $39,000 had been transferred out of my savings account and asked who authorized it. There was a brief silence, and then my father shrugged in a way that felt almost casual. He said Kyle needed startup money. He said it as if that explained everything, as if access to my savings was a minor administrative detail. Kyle jumped in quickly, saying he was opening a tech accessories shop with a friend, that it was in cell phone cases and chargers and other electronics, and that this was a huge opportunity. He spoke in broad, enthusiastic statements about potential profit margins and online marketing, but had no business plan, no paperwork, no incorporation documents, nothing concrete to show for it. When I asked how he accessed my account, he avoided the specifics and said Dad helped because it was for something important. My mother stepped forward and told me that I am successful and that I will earn it back, that this is what family does when one member needs a push to get ahead. She framed it as an investment in Kyle's future, as if my consent was optional. I felt a wave of disbelief so intense it almost numbed me. I said clearly that this was theft. I said that transferring nearly $40,000 out of my personal savings without my permission was not support, not generosity, not a misunderstanding, but theft. My father bristled at that word and said it was a family loan, that Kyle would pay it back once the business took off. Kyle nodded quickly, promising returns and growth, but his voice wavered under my stare. Standing there in my own kitchen, in a house where I no longer had my own bedroom and now barely had my own savings, I realized that the line they had crossed was not subtle or accidental. It was deliberate. They had decided that my work, my time, and my money were resources available to them without discussion. The word loan hung in the air, but it fell hollow. To me, there was only one accurate term for what had happened, and it echoed in my mind louder than anything they said. The morning after I called what they did theft, I drove to downtown Boise, instead of going straight to the job site, running on almost no sleep, but fueled by clarity I had not felt in months, because something in me had finally locked into place, and I understood that if I did not take formal action immediately, I would lose not only my savings, but any remaining control over my own life. I scheduled a consultation with a property attorney named Gregory Mills, whose office sat in a brick building a few blocks from the courthouse, and I remember sitting across from him in a quiet conference room, explaining that my parents and brother had been living in my house for over a year without a lease, without paying rent, and that nearly $39,000 had been transferred out of my savings account without my authorization. Saying it out loud to a professional stripped the situation of the emotional fog and reduced it to facts, and the facts sounded as bad as they felt. Gregory listened carefully, took notes, and asked direct questions about documentation, ownership, and financial access. I paid a $1,500 retainer on the spot, because I was done trying to handle this internally, and he told me that since there was no lease agreement and no formal rent arrangement, they were considered at will occupants, which meant I could serve a formal eviction notice and begin the legal process to have them removed within 30 days if they refused to leave voluntarily. Hearing that there was a structured path forward felt like inhaling air after being underwater too long. It was not immediate, and it was not painless, but it was real. That same afternoon, I went to my bank and began disputing the transfer, filing fraud paperwork and documenting everything I could. I changed passwords, froze accounts, and set up additional security measures because the realization that someone inside my own house had accessed my savings without consent left me feeling exposed in a way I had never experienced before. By the time I arrived at the construction site later that day, my phone buzzed with a call from our HR department asking if I had a moment to talk privately. Kyle had called my employer that morning and claimed that I was mentally unstable and unfit to supervise crews, alleging erratic behavior and emotional breakdowns at home. The accusation was so absurd that for a moment I almost laughed, but the fact that he had gone that far made my stomach tighten. HR told me they flagged it as potential harassment because the caller did not provide verifiable information and seemed personally motivated, but they still had to document it. I explained the family dispute in measured terms, provided context, and assured them there were no performance issues. My record with the company was solid, and my supervisors vouched for me, yet the fact that my own brother tried to jeopardize my career as retaliation burned deeper than anything else. That evening my phone began lighting up with text messages from unknown numbers. The messages were short and hostile, telling me I would regret humiliating them and that family does not forgive betrayal. I took screenshots of every single one and saved them to a secure folder because at that point I understood that documentation was not paranoia. It was protection. The tone of the messages escalated over the next 24 hours, shifting from guilt-based manipulation to outright threats, and each notification felt like another confirmation that I was not overreacting by involving a lawyer. When the formal eviction notice was served at the house, I made sure it was done by the book. Gregory arranged for a proper delivery, and I was present when the paperwork was handed over. My mother began crying almost immediately, her voice breaking as she accused me of tearing the family apart and throwing them onto the street. My father's reaction was different. His face hardened, and he said they would fight it, that I was making a mistake I could not undo. Kyle paced the living room, jaw clenched, muttering that I was ruining his future over money. At one point, Kyle stepped closer to me in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate, his posture aggressive, shoulders squared, as if he thought physical presence might make me reconsider. I told him calmly that if he touched me or refused to comply with the legal process, I would involve the police immediately. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure the words were clear. He held my stare for a few seconds and then backed off, the bravado fading when he realized I was no longer engaging on emotional terms. The house felt volatile after that, like a structure under stress that could crack at any moment. I no longer felt safe sleeping there, not because I expected outright violence, but because the tension was constant and corrosive. Gregory advised me that since I was a property owner, I had the right to remain, but he also acknowledged that sometimes temporary distance is the most practical choice while legal proceedings unfold. That night, I packed a suitcase with essentials and checked into a nearby Spring Hill Suites. Walking into that hotel room with its neutral walls and anonymous decor felt strangely liberating. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no television blaring from down the hall. I set my phone on a nightstand, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in silence that did not feel heavy or hostile. It felt clean. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up to footsteps overhead or arguments drifting through the vents. I did not hear the garage door open at midnight or someone rummaging in the kitchen. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep where your body finally releases tension you did not realize you were holding. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight filtering through hotel curtains, I felt a clarity I had almost forgotten was possible. The situation was not resolved, the money was not back in my account, and the eviction process was just beginning. But for the first time since this all escalated, I felt like I had reclaimed a small piece of control. A few days after the eviction notice was served and the reality of it began to settle in, my parents suddenly shifted their tone and asked for mediation, presenting themselves as reasonable and willing to compromise now that the legal process was no longer abstract, but actively moving forward. And they proposed that they would pay me $2,500 a month in rent if I would allow them to stay another 6 months, framing it as a fair arrangement that would give everyone time to stabilize under different circumstances. That amount might have sounded significant, but I understood immediately that the offer was not about fairness or responsibility. It was about buying time and regaining leverage, because rent was never the core issue. The core issue was that they had taken my bedroom without permission, transferred nearly $40,000 out of my savings without consent, attempted to damage my professional reputation, and then threatened me when I objected. I told them plainly that I did not want their rent, and that I was not interested in extending their stay under any financial arrangement, because what I wanted was my home back and accountability for what they had done, not a delayed version of the same dysfunction wrapped in a monthly payment. The mediation attempt dissolved quickly when they realized I would not negotiate away the principle of the situation, and the case moved forward to court. On the day of the hearing, I sat at the plaintiff's table with Gregory beside me, documents organized in a binder that represented every tangible proof of ownership and responsibility I could provide, including mortgage statements, property tax records, homeowners insurance policies, utility bills showing my name and consistent payment history, and maintenance invoices for repairs and upgrades I had funded over the past 2 years. My parents argued that I had effectively abandoned the property when I moved into the hotel, claiming that my temporary relocation meant I relinquished occupancy and that they had been maintaining the household in my absence. Hearing that argument almost felt surreal because it inverted the reality so completely that for a moment I wondered whether they genuinely believed it or simply hoped the judge might. When it was our turn to respond, Gregory calmly walked through the documentation, establishing that I was the sole legal owner, that there was no lease granting them tenancy rights beyond occupancy, and that my temporary stay at a hotel did not constitute abandonment property I continued to pay for in full. I spoke briefly, explaining that I had relocated temporarily for safety and peace due to escalating conflict, but that I continued paying every bill and maintaining the property financially throughout. The judge listened carefully, asked a few clarifying questions about the timeline and the absence of any rental agreement, and ultimately ruled in my favor, stating clearly that ownership and financial responsibility were not in dispute and that the eviction was lawful. They were given 2 hours to vacate the property under supervision, and deputies were present to ensure the process did not escalate. Watching them pack their belongings into boxes and trash bags felt like observing the aftermath of a storm that had ripped through my life for over a year. My mother cried intermittently, repeating that she never imagined it would come to this. My father moved stiffly, his expression tight and resentful. Kyle avoided eye contact, loading items into the back of a borrowed truck with abrupt, irritated movements. I stood in the living room, not triumphant, not vindictive, but steady, aware that this was a consequence of choices they had made, not an impulsive act on my part. Once they left and the deputies confirmed the property was vacated, I had the locks changed immediately. Hearing the click of new deadbolts sliding into place was unexpectedly emotional because it symbolized a restoration of boundaries that had been eroded over months of manipulation and entitlement. The house felt quiet again, not empty but reclaimed, and as I walked through each room I could see the traces of disruption, scuffed walls, displaced furniture, clutter that needed clearing. Yet beneath it all the structure remained solid, just as it had the day I bought it. On the financial side, the situation was only partially recoverable through the bank's fraud investigation and the freezing of joint access accounts that had been improperly linked. $21,000 was secured before it could be further dispersed, which meant more than half of the transfer amount was already gone. The remaining funds, I learned, had been spent by Kyle almost immediately on paying off personal debt and purchasing a used car under the justification that reliable transportation was necessary for his so-called business venture. There were no business filings, no storefront lease, no inventory beyond vague promises, just depleted funds and a vehicle in his name. Gregory discussed the possibility of a civil suit to pursue the remaining balance, outlining the process of obtaining a judgment and potentially garnishing future wages. But he was also realistic about the practicality of collecting from someone with no significant assets and unstable employment history. The cost, time, and emotional energy required to chase money that might never be recovered weighed heavily against the likelihood of meaningful restitution. I had already spent thousands on legal fees and countless hours managing fallout. I had to decide whether extending the battle would serve justice or simply prolong the damage. Standing alone in my living room after the locks were changed, I understood something clearly for the first time in this entire ordeal. I had spent years unconsciously playing a role of savior, believing that stability obligated me to absorb instability from others, that earning more meant tolerating more, that being responsible meant compensating for everyone else's irresponsibility. In court, when the judge ruled in my favor, it was not just a legal affirmation of property rights. It was a confirmation that boundaries are not cruelty and that refusing to be exploited is not betrayal. I had stopped playing savior the moment I chose accountability over appeasement, and even though $21,000 was all I managed to freeze, and the rest may never return, what I reclaimed was far more fundamental than money. I reclaimed the right to define my own limits, to protect what I built, and to live in my own house without being treated like a resource to be drained. A few months after the eviction was finalized and the house was finally quiet again, my company offered me a promotion to regional operations manager based out of Fort Collins, Colorado, a role that would oversee multiple project sites instead of just one, and came with a 30% raise. And for the first time in a long time, the idea of starting somewhere completely new did not feel like running away, but like moving forward with intention. I accepted the offer without hesitation, put the Boise house on the market, and within weeks it sold for $180,000 more than I had originally paid. which felt less like luck and more like confirmation that even after everything that had happened, the investment had still been solid and strategic. Signing the closing documents this time felt different than when I first bought it because I was not a proud first-time homeowner anymore. I was someone who defended his ground, absorbed losses, and still walked away standing. Moving to Fort Collins was not just a geographic change, but a psychological reset, and I approached it with a level of discipline I had never applied to my personal life before, setting firm rules about privacy, finances, and who had access to what. I changed my phone number, updated my email addresses, and blocked every known contact linked to my parents and Kyle, because I understood that boundaries only work when they are enforced consistently rather than negotiated under pressure. The first few weeks in Colorado felt almost unnaturally calm, as if I was waiting for chaos to follow me across state lines, but it never did. Work was demanding in a different way, more strategic and less physically exhausting, and the raise meant I could rebuild my savings at a pace that made the earlier loss feel less catastrophic. I met Olivia Hart at a local gym one evening after work, both of us reaching for the same set of dumbbells at the same time, and the conversation that started as an awkward apology turned into something steady and grounding over the following weeks. She was a CPA, analytical and composed, with a sharp way of cutting through emotional noise that I found both intimidating and reassuring. When the subject of family eventually came up, and I told her a condensed version of what had happened, she did not respond with pity or outrage, but with clarity, saying that boundaries are not cruelty, and that protecting yourself from repeated harm is not abandonment. She told me she had walked away from her own toxic family years earlier, and that the guilt fades when you stop confusing obligation with love. Hearing that from someone who had already navigated similar terrain felt stabilizing, as if I was no longer defending my choices alone. Over the next year, my life began to feel structured in a way that was healthy rather than restrictive. Olivia and I grew closer not through dramatic gestures, but through consistency, shared routines, and mutual respect for each other's independence. We discussed finances openly, kept separate accounts while planning joint goals, and agreed that transparency was non-negotiable. When we decided to buy a condo together, we did it methodically, reviewing contracts side by side, and ensuring both names were on the deed with clear expectations established from the beginning. The quiet inside that new space was not heavy like it had been in Boise after the eviction, but peaceful, and for the first time in years I could sit in my living room without feeling like I needed a brace for impact. When I proposed to Olivia, it was not driven by urgency or fear of losing something stable, but by a genuine recognition that partnership built on mutual accountability felt entirely different from the dynamic I had grown up with. Within that year, my savings were rebuilt to a level that restored confidence, my career was advancing, and my days were no longer dominated by crisis management outside of work. Peace was not dramatic. It was subtle and consistent, and I learned to appreciate that steadiness more than any adrenaline-fueled sense of obligation. Then one afternoon, almost exactly a year after I moved, there was a knock at the door of the condo that felt out of place, and when I opened I saw my mother standing there, older somehow than I remembered, her expression strained and urgent. She said Kyle was facing a medical emergency and needed $9,000 immediately, that insurance was complicated, and that they had nowhere else to turn. The words were delivered in the same cadence I had heard my entire life, a mixture of urgency and expectation, as if my role in the equation had never changed. I listened without interrupting and then told her calmly that I would not be sending any money, that if Kyle needed funds he could sell the car he purchased with the money taken from my savings, and that I would not participate in another cycle of rescue followed by resentment. She stared at me as if waiting for the familiar crack in my resolve, the moment where guilt would override logic, but it never came. I felt no surge of anger, no trembling conflict, no internal debate about being a good son. I simply felt neutral. After she left, Olivia asked how I felt, and I searched for an answer that was more complex than the truth. What I felt was nothing. No guilt, no satisfaction, no grief, just an absence of reaction where there once would have been panic or obligation. That emotional stillness unsettled me because it highlighted how far I had shifted from the person who once absorbed everyone else's instability as his responsibility. The fact that I could refuse without rage and without remorse was both a sign of growth and a reminder that something fundamental had hardened. I understood that boundaries had protected my peace, my finances, and my future, yet the complete absence of feeling toward my own family forced me to confront the reality that sometimes protecting yourself requires letting go of emotional ties entirely, and that realization carried a weight that was quieter but no less profound than anything that had happened before. Several months after my mother showed up unannounced asking for $9,000 and left with nothing but a firm refusal, I received a voicemail from an unfamiliar number in Idaho that I almost ignored out of habit. But something about the tone in the brief message made me listen all the way through, and I learned that my father had suffered a heart attack and was undergoing surgery with medical costs totaling $12,500, even after insurance adjustments. The message was not theatrical or manipulative in a way I had come to expect from my family. It was blunt, strained, and focused on numbers. They had managed to raise most of the amount through extended relatives and payment arrangements, but they were short $1,300 and facing delays in finalizing the hospital billing plan. I sat with that information for a long time before responding, because I understood that this was the exact type of scenario that historically would have pulled me back into automatic rescue mode, bypassing logic in favor of reflexive obligation. A heart attack is not a start of fantasy or a poorly planned business venture. It is a medical crisis, tangible and verifiable. Yet the context of our history did not disappear simply because the emergency was legitimate. I spoke with Olivia about it in measured terms, not asking for permission, but clarifying my own thinking, and I realized that if I chose to help, it would have to be under conditions that protected both my finances and my psychological boundaries. I called back and told them that I was willing to cover the remaining $1,300, but only under a legally binding loan contract with an 18-month repayment term and 8% interest, structured with fixed monthly payments and clear consequences for default. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when I outlined the terms, and then my father's voice came through, tight and offended, saying he would not owe his own son money as if I were a bank. He framed it as humiliation, as a reversal of roles that felt unnatural to him. I listened without raising my voice and explained that I was not offering charity, nor was I reopening the door to informal arrangements that blurred responsibility. This was a straightforward loan with documentation, nothing more and nothing less. For a few days there was no response, and I assumed pride would override practicality. But eventually my mother called back and said they would sign. I drafted the contract through a local attorney in Colorado to ensure it was enforceable, detailing the principal amount, the interest rate, the exact due date each month, and the total repayment schedule across 18 months. I included language specifying that payments must be made electronically and that failure to pay will result in standard collection procedures. When the documents were sent for signature, I felt a strange mix of detachment and clarity, as if I were negotiating with business partners rather than my own parents. My father hesitated at first, I was told, objecting again to the idea of formalizing debt between family members, but ultimately he signed. The signed contract arrived scanned and time-stamped, and once it did, I transferred the $1,300 directly to the hospital billing department rather than to them personally. The transaction was clean, documented, and limited in scope. There was no extra cushion, no rounding up, no open-ended promise of support. The first monthly payment arrived exactly on the agreed date. I remember noticing the deposit notification on my phone and feeling something unfamiliar, not triumph or vindication, but confirmation. The second payment arrived on time as well, and then the third. Month after month, without excuses or delays, the payments continued according to the schedule outlined in the contract. For the first time in my life, my parents honored a financial commitment to me with consistency rather than resentment. There were no late-night calls asking for extensions, no emotional appeals about unexpected expenses, just scheduled transfers that matched the agreement. As the month progressed, I allowed limited contact under strict conditions that I communicated clearly in writing. There would be one scheduled phone call per month, at a prearranged time, with no surprise visits, no unannounced appearances at my home or workplace, and no financial requests beyond the existing loan terms. If any of those boundaries were violated, communication would cease again. The structure may have seemed rigid to an outsider, but to me it was the only way to maintain stability, without sliding back into chaos. During those monthly calls, the conversations were restrained and factual. We discussed my father's recovery progress, general updates about work, and neutral topics like weather or extended relatives. When the conversation drifted toward guilt or subtle hints about money, I redirected it calmly and firmly. Over time, they seemed to adjust to the new format, perhaps recognizing that the alternative was silence. There was no sudden emotional reconciliation, no dramatic apology that erased the past, but there was a gradual shift in tone from entitlement to caution. The most striking part of the entire arrangement was not the repayment of $1,300 with interest, but the pattern established. They demonstrated, for 18 consecutive months, that they were capable of honoring a commitment when clear terms and consequences were in place. Each on-time payment served as quiet evidence that accountability was possible all along, just never required before. When the final payment cleared, including the accumulated 8% interest, I felt neither warmth nor bitterness. What I felt was steadiness. I had helped in a medical emergency without sacrificing my boundaries, and they had fulfilled their obligation without collapsing into resentment. The relationship, such as it was, had been redefined not by emotion but by structure. For the first time, contact with my family operated within rules that protected me rather than drained me, and while the closeness of earlier years was gone, what replaced it was something far more sustainable. Controlled interaction, documented expectations, and the understanding that boundaries, once enforced consistently, can transform even the most dysfunctional dynamic into something at least predictable. A few years after the structured loan with my parents was completed and contact had settled into something distant but predictable, I received news through a relative that Kyle had been arrested on burglary charges in Idaho and eventually sentenced to 4 years in prison, a development that felt both shocking and inevitable at the same time, because his pattern had always been one of cutting corners and assuming consequences would somehow bend around him. I did not attend hearings, and I did not reach out while he was incarcerated, not out of cruelty, but because I understood that any involvement from me would blur lines that had taken years to draw. During that period, my life in Colorado continued to expand in ways that were steady and deliberate, my career advancing, my marriage to Olivia deepening, and our routines forming a stable rhythm that no longer revolved around crisis management. When Kyle was released after serving a sentence, I did not expect to hear from him directly. Yet, one afternoon there was a knock on my office building's lobby reception, and security called up to say someone was asking for me by name. I went downstairs with measured curiosity and found him standing there, thinner, older, carrying himself with a restraint I had never seen in him before. There was no swagger, no half-grin masking insecurity, just a quiet stiffness that suggested experience had finally pressed against him in ways excuses could not deflect. He held an envelope in his hand and said he did not expect forgiveness and was not there to argue about the past. He said prison had taught him very clearly where lines are, not in abstract moral language, but in concrete consequences that do not negotiate. He handed me the envelope, and inside was $300 in cash, along with short handwritten notes stating that this was the first repayment toward the money he had taken years earlier. The amount was small compared to the $38,900 that had vanished from my savings account, but the gesture carried a weight disproportionate to the number. He did not frame it as a favor to me or as an attempt to repair our relationship. He framed it as something he needed to do for himself, an acknowledgement that the debt existed whether or not I chose to pursue it legally. I looked at him for a long moment before responding, because I wanted to be certain that whatever I said reflected who I had become rather than who I used to be. I told him I would accept the $300, not because I needed it or because it closed any chapter financially, but because if he was serious about rebuilding any sense of integrity in his own life, then earning back what he took was part of that process. I made it clear there would be no emotional reunion attached to the transaction, no dramatic reconciliation scene, just the understanding that repayment, if it continued, would be logged and documented like any other obligation. He nodded, almost relieved that the exchange remained structured rather than sentimental. After that meeting, I did not feel anger or vindication, only a quiet recognition that revenge had never been the goal. If I had wanted revenge, I could have pursued civil judgments more aggressively, sought wage garnishment, or pressed charges earlier when the theft occurred. But what I had ultimately chosen years before was something different. Control of my own environment, and the refusal to allow other people's chaos to define my trajectory. Accepting $300 did not restore the lost $38,900, and it did not erase the stress, the legal battles, or the months of sleeplessness, but it signaled that accountability was no longer a one-sided demand. Years passed, and my life in Colorado evolved in ways that would have felt unimaginable during the worst nights in Boise. Olivia and I married in a small ceremony surrounded by friends who respected boundaries as naturally as breathing. I received an executive promotion that expanded my regional oversight into multiple states, increasing both responsibility and compensation. And the discipline I once applied defensively became the framework for sustainable growth. We welcomed a daughter and named her Mila Grace Cole, a name chosen deliberately to reflect both strength and softness, a combination I had learned to value deeply. Parenthood reshaped my understanding of family in ways that were both tender and clarifying. When Mila grew old enough to ask simple questions about who we are and where we come from, she once asked if I had a family beyond the three of us. I answered that yes, I did, but the kind that matters most is the kind that respects each other. I did not elaborate on history or conflict because she did not need to inherit wounds that were not hers. What she needed was consistency, safety, and the knowledge that love does not require self-sacrifice at the expense of dignity. I never achieved full forgiveness in cinematic sense, the sweeping emotional absolution where past harms dissolve into understanding. What I achieved instead was something far more stable, the ability to choose how much access anyone has to my time, my finances, and my emotional bandwidth. I learned that peace is not passive. It is constructed through boundaries enforced repeatedly until they become second nature. The money that was stolen represented years of effort, but the lessons forged in its absence reshaped the architecture of my entire adult life. When I look back at the $38,900 that disappeared from my savings account all those years ago, I no longer feel the sharp sting that once accompanied a memory. What stands out instead is a chain of decisions that followed, each one moving me incrementally toward autonomy rather than resentment. I built a career that expanded beyond a single city, a marriage rooted in mutual accountability, and a home where my daughter grows up understanding that respect is not negotiable. I did not recover every dollar, and I did not restore every fractured relationship, but I secured something that cannot be transferred out of an account or taken without consent. I secured control over my life, sustained peace in my home, and a family defined not by obligation or guilt, but by choice and respect. And that is worth more than any sum that was ever taken from me.